These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. The book of Joshua tells us that after the death of Moses, a fellow named Joshua rallied the 12 tribes of Israel, crossed the Jordan River into Canaan, and had large, mostly successful battles at Jericho, Ai, Gibeon, Makkedah, Libnah, Lachish, Eglon, Hebron, Debir, Meron, and Hazor. Archaeology tells us that all of these towns existed, and many have destruction layers. But these archaeological evidences of destruction often come many centuries earlier or later than the supposed conquests of Joshua, and that nearly none of these were populated cities around 1200 BCE. Now, some take from this that Joshua was a complete fiction, that Israelites never invaded anywhere, there was no Canaanite genocide, and there was no people of Israel until the northern kingdom under King Omri appears in the 900s BCE. But given the thinness of evidence overall, we know so little about these 2 centuries from 1200 to 1000, drawing conclusions from pure lack of evidence is a bit premature and not in keeping with how archaeology proceeds in other parts of the world. More than that, there is pretty clearly evidence that there were some people of Israel in the region at this point, even if the details of the conquest itself is debatable. Anyway, in the narrative, Joshua is sort of Moses' apprentice, and as soon as Moses dies, he rallies all the people of Israel to cross the Jordan River. Now, at this point in the biblical narrative, pretty much all of the rituals, laws, beliefs, and practices that we would later associate with Judaism are supposed to have been established. There are still some things that will get added later, but the folks crossing the river, or at least having the river parted for them, are, according to the biblical narrative, good, faithful Jews. So that's claim 1 for today, and we can see some evidence from that and some pretty noticeable pushback. Once over the river, there is a famous battle at Jericho, followed by a bunch of other battles, followed by a bunch of settlement into the 12 tribal regions. The specifics of these battles are extremely hard to confirm, with many of the places having been much more significantly destroyed long before Joshua's arrival. But the impression of battle in general, both the descriptions of the campaigns, the geography of the settlement patterns, and the historiographical form of the book, are in fact so typical of the era in general that if this was a real conquest, we would expect any written record to take on pretty much exactly the form we have in the book of Joshua. But that's claim 2 for today. Finally, once all the winning is done, there's a general perception that God and Joshua ordered the genocide of sweeping numbers of Canaanites, perhaps all of them. An assertion which misunderstands the genre of the book of Joshua and is in fact contradicted both by the second half of Joshua and by the book of Judges and all subsequent history, both biblical and secular. God, in his infinite wisdom, justice, and mercy, definitely wanted a genocide, but we're going to look at the fact that it pretty much didn't actually happen. Starting then with the battles, because that's everyone's favorite part. Now Joshua sends some spies into Jericho, then marches around the city for 7 days, then has the whole army shout really loud, then the walls come a-tumbling down. Now there are 3 general interpretations of this battle. The first is that it happened just as the traditional accounts say, basically God did it all. The second is that an earthquake happened during the siege, either by coincidence or by the hand of God. The third is that the falling of the walls is semi-metaphorical. Saying the walls fell, that's used commonly enough in military discussions without literally meaning that the entire structure of the walls went from vertical to horizontal. It could just mean that between the spies in the town letting people in, maybe through Rahab's window, and the terror of being overwhelmed, first by 7 days of total silence while being encircled, and then a whole bunch of shouting soldiers, and then the wall could have been taken without a fight. Essentially, a surrender of the city, or perhaps just an abandonment of a portion of the defenses by terrified defenders. In this view, it's not wrong to say that the walls fell, just that it doesn't take the literal meaning of bricks becoming on the ground. Anyway, whether you take the battle to have been a matter of psychological warfare or of divine fiat, there is a bigger issue in history. The walls of Jericho did indeed exist, and were indeed quite impressive, except that they fell sometime during the Middle Bronze Age, centuries too early by the standard dating. This, by the way, is one of the favorite data points of people who follow the traditional biblical date for the Exodus occurring in 1447. But hopefully we've gotten enough sense of Canaanite history from our previous episodes that we know that this is untenable. Anyway, Jericho had no detectable settlement during the decades around 1200 BCE, so the question is naturally raised, how could Joshua have invaded an empty city? Now, people have gone down the list of places in the campaign of Joshua. The city of Ai, which may literally mean ruin, may have literally been a ruin, having been uninhabited since the early Bronze Age. Gibeon, the next site up, is a bit of a question mark as they haven't found traces of settlement, but they did find 7 fairly rich tombs in the area from the late Bronze Age, suggesting there may have actually been a town there. The next stop, Makeda, is not known for certain. We have a general idea it was southeast of Lachish, but without a firm identification of the site, we can't investigate if it was inhabited at 1200 or not. Libnah and Debir are in a similar situation, but Lachish definitely existed, and has 2 prominent destruction layers in 1150 and 1130, plus or minus a bit. These dates were established archaeologically, so there's always error bars. Eglon has most likely been located, but not studied deeply for this period, while Hebron has been so continuously inhabited that archaeology has a hard time establishing anything more than the fact that it was certainly a noteworthy city in the time of Joshua. Finally, the site of Hazor shows a definite destruction layer around 1200 BCE and continuous occupation on both sides of that. Now, there is almost certainly some podcast somewhere spending an episode on each of these sites, and honestly, I'd love to do a whole military history, just get way deep into all the speculations about all the invasions. I like military history. It's a lot of fun. Anyway, the bottom line is that archaeology is a really, really hard science, and when you're working with as little physical evidence as we have for the period from 1200 to 1000 BCE, the historical interpretation that you impose on the evidence radically changes how all the evidence looks, especially if, like most people, you ignore evidence that doesn't fit your story. Now, in archaeology, ignoring evidence isn't actually necessarily malpractice. It's far from uncommon for dating mistakes to be made, for items to fall into the wrong dating layer, or for there just to be outliers that don't really fit with their apparent context. Plus, any purely archaeological dating method exists with pretty wide uncertainty bands, and it's ultimately a judgment call whether you stick your year estimate in the middle or on either end of those uncertainty bands. There is a skeptical case that fits in with all the archaeological evidence. There may have been no Israelite invasion in 1200. The cities with destruction layers could well have been destroyed by any number of other invaders during this chaotic time. Any absence of evidence For any part of the Joshua story, cities without signs of inhabitation, cities without destruction layers, or places without clear sign of Israelite settlement, in the skeptical view, these become evidence of absence. Now, I don't agree with this view necessarily, but I want to stress that it's perfectly consistent to take this view from the archaeology. There simply isn't unstoppable, obvious proof of anything. Now, some group called Israel must have existed. Most radical skeptics will deny even that, despite the written record and the settlements along the Jordan. But archaeology by itself confirms very little beyond just that. And the people who therefore hold to very little are not necessarily crazy or even anti-religious. They could just be being very careful with their evidences. Now, there's also a faithful case that fits with the archaeological evidence. Some of these cities do have destruction layers and inhabitation layers that fit with the general sense of the dates of an invasion around 1200. Those cities which don't have inhabitation layers, well, we know from looking at Tel Arad that this doesn't mean there was no one there. The end of the Late Bronze Age was a population nadir for the entire Levantine region, and a ruin with a relatively small number of people without manpower or resources to make noticeable improvements to a town in which they're basically just squatting. Well, for people who are used to that thing, that could seem just as legitimate as a major town does for us nowadays. It's all a question of perspective and what your culture expects in a town. Damage to the walls of, say, Jericho could have been filled in with wood, which may leave no archaeological trace, yet still seem impenetrable to a group of Israelite nomads without a great deal of siege experience. Now, Ai is named for being a ruin, potentially, and its inhabitants were almost certainly then transients or squatters, so why not assume other of these cities are far less impressive than we might otherwise assume? Now, these would still be attractive targets to the people of the age, used to far less in the way of urbanization and prosperity than even their Middle Bronze Age ancestors. I've drawn the parallel before, but I really do think it's instructive for modern minds to think about modern media like Mad Max or Fallout or The Walking Dead to kind of get a sense for how the scale of things may have been in the highly violent and unsettled period of the Bronze Age collapse. But what of the destruction layers that are absent, the towns with no visible sign of being destroyed in this period? Now, the lack of destruction layers doesn't necessarily mean a lack of invasion, something archaeologists are quite happy to discuss in non-Israelite contexts. The Muslim invasions of the Near East in the 600s CE, the Norman invasion of England in 1066, and the empire-wide Roman civil wars during the time of Julius and Augustus Caesar. These are all examples of different sorts of major wars involving significant shifts in regional power, all of them way bigger than anything Joshua was doing, for which exceedingly few destruction layers are evident in archaeology. Sometimes cities just aren't sacked in ways that cause the entire town to burn down around them. Sometimes cities are restored quickly enough that things get cleaned up. Sometimes there's no actual fighting in the city itself, and the plundering is far more orderly, with slaves and loot being offered up without significant resistance by a broken population. Now, do we know that any of these things happened? Well, outside the biblical narrative, we know almost nothing. We have no evidence of a military leader named Joshua leading a host of Habiru soldiers into Canaan. But we have enough parallels in other times to know that such a thing is completely possible, and it's not strongly contradicted by the absence of evidence in this case. It could just as easily have been an alternate theory, where many separate Habiru groups invaded from the east around the same time that the multiple Sea People groups are invading from the west, and the ones who later coalesced into the tribes of Israel simply assembled all of their traditions from that time into a single mythical conquering hero. Now, this story that I'm telling you, it's not biblical or archaeological, but it is plausible from a standpoint of how we've seen myths develop in other cultures, and it's not contradicted by archaeological evidence, and there's some reasonably intelligent people that put forward basically a version of this. Another theory, which we'll look at a bit more later, is that maybe the whole story was made up during the time of the monarchy, with Saul and David or Solomon or even one of the later kings trying to unite 12 disparate tribes together with a fictional story of a time when they were all united way back in the forgotten past. And this actually has echoes of the Greek and Roman mythic formation of their own prehistory, and it's not contradicted by archaeology. But before moving on, the stage is not open for literally every possible possibility. I mean, there's not aliens coming down. We would see little green skeletons or something, I don't know. We discussed that there must have been some sort of Israel, and almost certainly some sort of Yahweh recognized by at least some groups. So the hyper-skeptical position that none of it existed is, I think, ultimately untenable. Additionally, there's a hyper-literal case to be made from all the archaeological evidence as well. There's destruction layers from around 1400s that fits nicely with the strict biblical chronology of an Exodus in 1447. There's plenty of articles from biblical literalists taking every small data point in isolation and insisting that it then proves the entire Bible. However, having just counseled that we take all viewpoints respectfully because archaeology is really hard and full of uncertainty, that doesn't actually apply to the 1400s Exodus theory. Because for all that the Bronze Age collapse is extremely dark, historically speaking, the exact opposite is true in the 1400s, especially for Egypt and Canaan. In fact, I'm not sure if Egypt and Canaan have a more well-documented period than the 1400s and 1300s until you get into the classical period of Greece and Rome a millennium later. We know sometimes to the day when the Egyptian army marched into the cities with destruction layers. We know the political landscape of the major cities and many of the minor ones. We know the names of the kings of Jerusalem, and we know their gods in this time period. We know that there were no Philistines, and that there was nowhere in Canaan that escaped Egyptian slaves could go to be free of Egypt. In the Bronze Age collapse, there are 0 contemporary literary sources, and the archaeological evidence is unusually thin. In the Amarna period, that's the 1400s, there are thousands of contemporary literary sources and a ton of archaeological evidence. This means that while the skeptical view or the late Exodus theory both have space to wiggle in the darkness of the Bronze Age collapse, the early Exodus theory has nothing of the sort. There is, in fact, so much light that this theory simply gets squeezed out. And it's only by taking archaeological data points in isolation, ignoring the wider context for any of the finds, that such a case can be sustained at all. But so far we've looked primarily at matters relating to conquest because that's the focus of the biblical and popular narratives, because violence is a ton of fun and settlement is sad and boring. But actually, one of the most fascinating archaeological stories to come out of the last few decades of research into early Iron Age settlement patterns, particularly with an eye for identifying Israelite settlements, is that there might be Israelite settlements. Now, populations in this early Iron Age were far more transient than in previous eras, likely due to both climate and violence, and extremely low for the region historically speaking. However, Thanks probably to the massive influx of invaders, it does seem that the population of Canaan and the surrounding regions increased noticeably over the course of this period. And by about 900 BCE, the population seems to be now double that low point of the Late Bronze Age, give or take quite a lot. People were definitely settling the region, though who they were remains a puzzle. Now, the area we care about today is the east and west banks of the Jordan River, the territories approximately of Ephraim and Manasseh, or the Jordan River Valley considered geographically. Around the Bronze Age collapse, we see a number of small settlements pop up, averaging around 400 people per settlement all over this area. There's almost no sign of conflict in this region for this period of time, and it may well have been basically empty when these settlers arrived, or it may have been very easy to push out the nomadic peoples who were previously there, or these people may have always been there and simply transitioned in place from pastoralism to settled life. Materially, they look pretty much like Canaanites from any other part of Canaan, and many argue that these people and the other claimed Israelite settlements dated to later in what we could call the period of the Judges are in fact nothing but Canaanite settlements, either because the Israelites were, in their view, indistinguishable from their neighbors, even in religious matters until the Babylonian exile, or because the Israelites didn't exist as a people until the monarchy period. However, this is all pretty much exactly what we would expect from the biblical narratives. The Israelites are never presented as anything other than a Western Semitic people, one among many, and the biblical narrative even claims family or tribal linkages to many of the neighboring cultures. This may mean that Yahweh, or some version of him, may have been considered as one of the gods of these people in a polytheistic context. That part is debated and kind of speculative. We know they had El, and the Israelites called Yahweh El. I'm not getting into it. But likely, it also means that all the people in that area are recognized by the Israelites themselves as being part of a wider cultural group with broad similarities in living conditions and practices. For sure, God tells his people in the biblical narrative to be peculiar, to be different from the people around them, and indeed to commit mass slaughter to prevent the possibility of later integration with the wider culture. But at the same time, the narrative is also pretty clear to tell us that overall, the Israelites did not actually avoid integration. They kept communities of Canaanites alive on purpose. Some they bargained with, some they kept as slaves. They took Canaanite women as wives. They took Canaanite women as sex slaves. They simply failed to conquer large portions of the promised land. It's really only in the popular imagination that Joshua came in and conquered the entire Holy Land, maybe with a few small holdouts, because that is the easy surface reading for people unfamiliar with the geography and sort of skipping through the many list chapters in favor of the much more exciting narrative chapters. And I don't blame anyone for reading the Bible like that. The lists are super boring, especially if you don't have a reference to put them in context. But it does generate a mistaken historical impression that's fueled a lot of discussion. The Bible plays up Joshua's conquests in much the same way as the military narratives of Babylon and Assyria and Egypt play up the conquests of their kings. Every victory is a sweeping victory. Every defeat is minimized, ignored, or ascribed to the wishes of a fickle or angry god, and the people are always slaughtered and always thoroughly plundered. Instead, what we see, if we see the Israelites at all in the archaeological record, is a pattern of settlements around the Jordan River Valley on both sides, mostly small settlements consistent with a people who are not 100% agricultural just yet. Then in the Joshua narrative, we see essentially two major military campaigns, one along the southern border of the settlement area that we see in archaeology, and one along the northern border of that same archaeological area. Neither the archaeology nor the narrative really supports a total, one-time conquest led by a particular military leader. Rather, we have something of a picture of a group of Habiru who take advantage of the general weakness of Egypt to start conquering a chunk of territory along the Jordan River. There's no historical confirmation of the existence of Joshua, but there must have been one or a series of leaders, and given the time scale of the Jordan Valley settlements, it's entirely possible that entering into that region was a matter for a single generation, suggesting a single military leader. Was his name Joshua? I don't know. We're going to call him Joshua. Now, it wasn't all that long ago that I was talking about the Sea Peoples and mentioning that they probably entered into the Levant and the Near East in general without a single military leader. And I was talking about the many migratory tribes and discussing how all these tribes didn't really need any coordination to enter the region and cause mass destruction. Some have posited that in a similar way, each of the 12 tribes of Israel may have entered separately and only later joined into sort of political federation which was justified with presumably fictional religious historical narratives. However, this is a view that applies mostly towards large-scale cultural movements. Within any individual tribe, there's a leader organizing and directing. Within the Sea Peoples, both the written and archaeological sources let us know that these invaders had a lot of diversity, and so we have reason to think that they could have arrived by being pushed by a larger historical wave. Now, that same historical wave may have been a factor pushing Israel, but from this archaeological record, what little we have of it, the picture it paints is far more of a single group in terms of Israel, which would have had a military leader, not a wave of disparate tribes. Now, the biblical story is a bit more conflicted. Sometimes the 12 tribes seem like internal divisions of a single organization, while sometimes they seem like a coalition of disparate elements. And indeed, as you look through the different books of the Old Testament, the authors themselves don't always seem to agree on the list of what tribes make up the 12 tribes. There's the canonical list that everyone's familiar with, but sometimes some of those names don't show up in some of the lists that we look at, and instead much more minor sub-tribes get listed as if they were one of the 12 tribes of Israel. So maybe even those tribes didn't exist at all times. Maybe they shifted over time. Maybe they developed over time. We don't really know. This may be a result of different biblical authors and editors trying to emphasize different aspects of the ancient Israelite nation, or it could reflect actual shifts over time in who these people are and how unified they are. Or, of course, it could reflect that the whole story was invented whole cloth at a later date. Whatever the case, we don't see conquests without a conqueror, not on the level of single polities. Even the Sea Peoples had leaders, they just had a bunch of them. And Israel, during the time of emergence in Canaan, appears to have been a single people group as far as we can tell, since we can be pretty sure that any sort of emergence in Canaan would have involved violently displacing at least someone, maybe just a thin population of scattered nomads and squatters, or a handful of underpopulated settlements, but there must have been some sort of military leader. We can, for want of a better term, call this military leader Joshua. Now, just like with Moses, or indeed pretty much any ancient figure, we can't say much about the specific details and dramas of his life without recourse to the written sources, or in Joshua's case, just to the Bible. Naming him as Joshua is just a provisional guess in the absence of better options, but for him to claim to have undertaken campaigns on the northern and southern edges of what archaeology confirms to be the general area of early Israelite settlement suggests strongly that there really was such a campaign. Anyway, I feel like we're starting to get a bit lost in the weeds here, but if we stick our head out and we look around a bit, we could tell the following story. Now, it's not the only possible story, but we are starting to move from a range of possibilities closer into an archetypal narrative with very wide error bars. We know that from the 1400s that there was a desert people with some affiliation to someone called Yahweh. We know from the Merneptah Stela that there was a people called Israel in Canaan in 1200. We know from archaeology, which we're going to get deeper into next episode. It's not going to fit. We're already at like half an hour. We know from archaeology that people following the customs ascribed to Yahweh worshippers in the Bible appeared around the Jordan River Valley at about the same time. And we have a later written account of battles which appear to trace the general outlines of those first settlements, even though not all of these places have inhabitation and destruction layers from the same era, suggesting maybe that the whole area was sparsely populated and relatively easy for a small group to dominate. Nothing here is inconsistent with the idea that a Habiru group with particular religious customs arrived from the desert west of Canaan and settled around the Jordan River Valley, displacing their neighbors through violence. No divine assistance is necessarily required for any step here, neither is divine assistance ruled out, assuming that the divinity in question exists at all. This much at least leaves the door open for a pretty maximally literalist view, while in my mind it casts a lot of doubt on the idea that Israel didn't exist at all. But then what about the idea that Joshua personally conquered all of Canaan and slaughtered every last Canaanite in a horrific genocide that should render Abrahamic faiths as profoundly anathema as the Nazi Party? This is a concern which has driven both faithful pastors and humanist skeptics alike to denounce not only Joshua, but the Bible as a whole. And yet looked at in the context of similar Near Eastern writings and the other chapters of the Bible itself, we see that there was no systematic genocide. There was no total conquest. And the Israelite entry into Canaan, both archaeologically and biblically, looks like little more than the very typical emergence of a minor and fleeting power, which for the next 2 centuries is exactly what Israel is. Now, first off, we should acknowledge that the conquest of Canaan, in whatever form it took, was not a bloodless victory. People died. People who didn't die were maimed. Some of them were enslaved, and property damage impoverished everyone. In the ancient mindset, this wasn't a good thing. A conquest completed without any killing was always preferable to one that killed a whole town, and this wasn't just an economic matter either. There's no society in which private murder is acceptable, and ancient wars always had to be justified. Now, they could be justified by self-defense, or the will of the gods, or, let's be honest, ambition, or all of these, because mere private gain was not considered a justification for killing, even if the desire for gain was secretly in the hearts of the warring kings, or not always secretly. We're going to look more at the philosophy of ancient war when we get to the Assyrians and their famous brutality, but for now we can say that even the Assyrians had maybe rules, maybe more like general guidelines about when slaughter was and was not appropriate. And they always appeared to at least offer enemies a way to avoid the worst fates. Now, still, we shouldn't overstate the matter here. War is and has always been hell. And any violent invasion involves people being killed, people being maimed, people being enslaved, and other various terrible things. Atrocities may have been disliked in the abstract, but they were engaged in whenever war arrived in a land. The moral question of whether God's people should have been total pacifists, keeping well away from anything which would inevitably cause such evil, it's not really relevant. It wasn't what happened in history, and there are theological reasons in a Christian context why God uses war, from it being an expression of human agency to it being a tool of national punishment. The more historically relevant and, I think, more interesting question is whether God allowed a war of exceptional cruelty when he sanctioned Joshua's crusade. Now let's just pick one reading from Joshua chapter 6 as an example. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord, and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it, but they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. At that time Joshua pronounced this solemn oath: Cursed before the Lord is one who undertakes to rebuild this city, Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn son he will lay its foundations. At the cost of his youngest he will set up its gates. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout the land. Now, I began studying this with the idea in my mind that Joshua's conquest was not fundamentally different from conquests among other Near Eastern nations, or indeed other ancient people in general. The amount which they were practically able to destroy was fundamentally limited. Partly this is due to the fact that capital investment in even a great city was not all that significant compared to how much complex stuff gets built today. Once a field is flattened, it's a lot of work to rip it up. Once trees are planted, they're remarkably hard to chop down and uproot. This is something Victor Davis Hanson, back before he got super political, this was one of his emphases when talking about classical warfare. Apparently he owned a olive grove or something, and it's a lot of work to pull up an olive grove. An army doesn't have that much time unless they're really dedicated to it. And houses and walls and public buildings in the ancient world, they're made of mud and wood. And in a town, they'd be able to flee well ahead of an army and scatter. They could live in tents or just in the open, and that wouldn't be that significant a shift in their overall standard of living, provided they don't starve to death for various reasons. These scattered peoples are hard for an army to round up. They'll grab some of them, but never all. And even in a battle itself, the casualties in ancient battles were only very rarely more than 5 to 10% of each side before a victor was decided, and a larger portion would be killed in the subsequent rout. In modern African conflicts, which are often on the scale of ancient conflicts, men with trucks and automatic weapons really can empty whole towns. But those same men with only foot transportation and hand weapons, while still capable of great violence, suddenly you take that technology away and they're fundamentally limited in the amount of slaughter that they can inflict on a region without a great deal of effort and often a state apparatus just wholly overwhelming a region. Still, the ancients were unaware of the heights to which human butchery would reach 3,000 years after their own time. They were doing their best to conquer land in the way they knew how, and part of that way involved proclaiming as loudly as possible the consequences of those who resisted them. We've seen this over and over in our looks at other parts of Mesopotamia. King whoever doesn't merely defeat the enemy in battle, but slaughters his enemy, destroys the cities, enslaves all the people. Except that we know the story for these defeated peoples often continues. If you haven't listened to the previous episodes about ancient Mesopotamia, I strongly suggest, of course, that you go back and listen to some of them, and of course, like and subscribe and share this podcast with all your friends, because you can hear it all pretty much anywhere. And if you're listening sometime in the far future, I recommend that you stay on the show and listen to the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which is going to be coming up after Israel. But without diverting into all of that, we can return simply to the Merneptah Stela, which proudly announces that Israel was utterly destroyed and was left with no seed. A statement that we can clearly recognize as factually untrue. Now, just like the Merneptah Stela and countless other examples, dramatic exaggeration was simply part of the genre in which Joshua, especially those first 12 chapters, belongs. Now, it's an interesting question to what degree the common people of both Israel and the Near East in general understood these to be exaggerations in ancient times. But the writers and kings themselves clearly know that this is a style, and it's not as dry and literalistic as a modern textbook. And from all that, we can start to think that Joshua's conquest was not in any way morally exceptional, and was in fact far more partial than it would seem from a naive reading, especially of chapter 12. In that chapter, Joshua's scribe claims to have defeated everyone of significance in Canaan and overrun all the territory, which makes it all the more odd that the following chapters are dedicated to lists of all the places that Joshua failed to conquer, including places listed by name in chapter 12, most notably Jerusalem. But there's something morally different about Joshua's conquest compared to most other Near Eastern wars of conquest that we know about. That is, that every time the people of Israel conquer a place and then act like normal conquerors, enslaving the people and plundering the goods, God gets angry. Unlike other Near Eastern wars and other Near Eastern gods, Yahweh has ordered the actual, complete genocide of the Canaanite people, a command which the Israelites, either through moral qualms or a desire for earthly riches, pretty much refuse to carry out to the fullest. There are a few slaughters here and there, but as we're going to look at going forward, the Israelite refusal to actually slaughter all the Canaanites is something that's going to come back to haunt them. And God's ultimate judgment on Israel and Judah can fundamentally be traced back theologically to this failure. Even the failures in Ezra and Nehemiah, even the failures that Jesus is criticizing in his own day, these all come from this fundamental, I guess you could call it original sin, but I think that concept's already been taken. Anyway, the matter revolves around the Hebrew word Herem, related to the much more famous Arabic word haram, meaning forbidden, and which I have been asked about a surprising amount. Herem in Hebrew means something like devoting an object to the gods through sacrificial destruction. We don't really have an exact map for that word in English, or as far as I know, any modern language. In God's words, the whole of Canaan was Herem, something which he was using the armies of Israel to destroy utterly. And once it was cleared off the face of the earth, it and its people would be wholly in the spiritual arms of God. Now we assume that once they're in those spiritual arms, they're due for a particularly harsh judgment, but we don't really know. However, by enslaving or otherwise not butchering every single Canaanite man, woman, and child and their goats, the people of Israel are rebelling against God by taking for themselves the things which God has declared to be his. Additionally, for the writers of the Deuteronomistic history, say that 4 times fast, the failure to remain separate from the Canaanites, most easily accomplished with the complete destruction of Canaanite people and ideas, was the ultimate failure of the Israelite kingdoms. If the people and their altars had been destroyed, the thinking clearly goes, then the people of Israel would not have been tempted into following false idols and thus never invited God's judgment upon them. And so while the morality of the Canaanite conquest, as it actually happened, both historically and biblically, is pretty much the same as any other conquest, and should be discussed in terms of the world that Joshua's army found itself in, the morality of the conquest as it was urged by God is actually significantly more severe. Favorable mention is made to Numbers chapter 31, where Moses orders the Moabites who had tempted the people of Israel to be utterly slaughtered. All the men killed, all the boy children killed, all the non-virgin women killed, and all the virgin girls be taken as concubines. This is the sort of thing that happens in the worst horror stories of African warfare, condemned the world over. And though Joshua's people did not, in the end, have the stomach for it, a modern humanist ethic simply has no way to reconcile what God urged of the Israelite people with the ethics of the modern age. But getting too deep into theology does bring us away from our point. My point in going so deep into this is not to argue the theology, but to point out that many people, precisely because they're trying to deal in some way with the moral difficulties modern people face when confronting the bloody parts of Joshua, do damage to both the biblical text and history, when instead they should either be reconsidering their moral foundations in light of Scripture, or they should be rejecting the words of God while accepting that this is what God at least intended and probably vaguely historical. Anyway, much like the conquest of the American frontier, it wasn't all genocide and conquest. There was also settlement, which again gets us back to the question of whether or not these are actually Israelites, as opposed to just another brand of Canaanite at this early age. So join us next time for the 4 archaeological markers of an Israelite settlement, and pretty much just that. Archaeology isn't my strong suit, but this stuff is kind of interesting and has some really cool implications. Thank you for listening.